It's the big international story, with politicians and world leaders having now concluded their first high-level segment. The negotiators and ministers are now left behind to have intense discussions around the details of the loss and damage fund, which was announced on the first day of the COP28 summit. Now, there will also be a global stake of where each country is in terms of reducing their carbon emissions and moving away from using coal, oil and gas. Let's get you up to speed with the latest. Bring in Newzroom Afrika's Ziyanda Ngcobo live to us from Expo City in Dubai. And that's the big question, Ziyanda, making sure that this is not just a talk show, but moves us closer to those all-important targets.
That's right, Ziyanda, and you'll know that now is the time where the nitty-gritties are going to be hashed out. In fact, the first draft of that global stocktake agreement was concluded on Friday, and basically, Ziyanda, each country is sharing where they are with their emissions targets. There's a great push for an end to fossil fuels. That's what's actually in that first draft that I've just mentioned. But the issue here, and this is where the politics comes in, is around the fact that Africa only contributes around 2% towards those carbon emissions, and so yet there's a huge push for countries like South Africa to move away from using coal for their energy supply, and yet we've also got our issues surrounding load shedding, which are well documented. So this is when the wording and the text of this document, I mean, for instance, sometimes the negotiations get as pedantic as debating around the word just. What does just mean when you talk about just energy transition? Why is it being dubbed as just? Is it not enough that it's a transition on its own? So these are really, the moments where it gets quite technical in the science, but also in the text. And I want us to reflect then on where South Africa is when it comes to its 2030 emissions targets, because we've already, noted that we won't meet our 2030 targets, but there are several reasons that have been attributed towards this. Let's listen into this.
This was the Paris Climate Summit in 2015, when South Africa was among nations pledging to reduce their emissions. Now the world's 11th biggest greenhouse gas emitter is set to miss those legally binding targets, 3 senior government officials have confirmed. Under the Paris Climate Accords, South Africa vowed to cut emissions to between 350 and 420 million metric tons by 2030. That's from 442 million in 2020. To achieve this, it plans to decommission 8 coal-fired power plants. However, switching to a renewable energy policy has been hampered by bureaucratic delays. And then there's the power crisis at state-owned utility Eskom. South Africa has been suffering blackouts of sometimes up to 10 hours a day for the past 18 months. That now makes the emissions target unrealistic, said the officials, who declined to be named because the information is not yet public. The Environment Ministry said the country remained committed to achieving its Paris Agreement commitments, and that it was too early to say the 2030 targets would be missed. However, the Electricity Minister said the decommissioning of power plants must be delayed, given the power crisis, which he described as of existential proportions. But South Africa is not alone. Several wealthy countries and companies have been backtracking on climate pledges. That includes Canada, which has said it will miss its 2030 targets. Global oil and gas giants ExxonMobil and Shell have either delayed or abandoned shifting to renewables. Today, the United Nations said fossil fuel output by 2030 will be more than double levels consistent with the 2015 Paris climate goals.
So, Ziyanda, that's where we stand as South Africa, and I can tell you now that another discussion that is taking place is around tripling nuclear capacity by 2050. And so that's the discussion that's taking place, and how countries are going to be able to fast-track this. Notably, visible or visibly absent, I should say, is the likes of U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping, who those two countries countries are amongst the biggest transgressors when it comes to carbon emissions, and this then becomes the issue and the tussle between the global north and the global south, and how then we deal with the issue of climate financing. And in fact, this is one of the COPs that has seen the highest number of bankers in attendance because of the issue around this. And of course, we've been talking about that loss and damage fund, Ziyanda, and now it's going to boil down to how it's going to be operationalized. At what stage do you get access to this funding? How do you restructure the multilateral financial systems to deal then with issues of the negative effects of climate change, in particular for the African continent?
All very important questions, and we'll know you'll ventilate them for us throughout the course of the day. For now, Ziyanda Ngcobo, live just there from Expo City in Dubai. Thanks very much indeed.